Our keynote speaker this morning is the creator of Wardley Mapping, a framework that has changed how leaders around the world navigate complexity and strategy. Simon Wardley has twice been named among the top 50 most influential people in the UK. He brings deep insights into economics, technology, and organizational change. He's also a fellow Eurovision fan, and he believes in death by PowerPoint. So please welcome Simon Wardley, here to show us how to chart a course through uncertainty.
Espresso Macchiato, you didn't vote for it. Such a favorite song of mine. My name's Simon Wardley. How many of you have heard of Wardley Mapping before? Wow, it's not just me. Oh, that's fantastic. So I'm going to talk about from here to there and back again. I'm going to talk about maps and repeatable patterns. I better just give you an idea of where we're going. I'm going to start off with my origin story, how I got into mapping. Then I'm going to talk about what a map is and what a map isn't. Then I'm going to talk about patterns that you see. I'm going to use that to explain change. And then we're going to talk a little bit about AI. Oh, I hate that term. Obviously, AI is a field, and we're going to, focus on large language model GPTs. And then I'm going to talk about some of the changes to coding. Now, the really interesting thing about the changes of coding, I have to dive deep into culture and sovereignty to explain the problems. Does that sound all right? And can you hear me at the back? Yes? Good. All right. So, origin story. Many years ago, I used to work for this company, online photo service called Fotango, 16 different lines of business, very profitable, but it had a problem. The problem was this person, the fat cat in charge, our CEO. Now, our CEO was completely clueless. They were making stuff up as they went along. They had no idea what they were doing. And I know this for a fact because I was the CEO. I used to come up with these wonderful statements of our strategy. Our strategy is customer focus. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. A friend of mine was Kent Beck. We'd adopted extreme programming back in 1999, slightly before the Agile Manifesto came out. Quickly discovered it doesn't work everywhere. But this strategy I'd literally pinched from another company and simply changed a few words. That was the level of my strategic play. I had no idea what I was doing. And then I ended up in a bookshop in Charing Cross. And I'd read all these books on strategy and was still none the wiser. And I was talking to the bookseller, and she asked me, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? And I hadn't. Now, she was a fantastic bookseller. And because these books are all translations, she sold me 2 different versions of the book. And I'm so grateful for this, because it was in the reading of the second version I noticed a particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. 1, have a purpose, a moral imperative to do something. 2, understand the landscape, the environment that you're operating in. Then understand the heavens, the weather, the climatic pattern, how that landscape is changing. Then you get into doctrine and principles of how you structure and organize yourself. And finally, you get into leadership, which is all about gameplay. And I was like, oh, this sort of makes sense. And I got really fascinated by this idea of how do I understand the landscape I'm operating in. And that's what got me into maps. So I started reading all I could on military history, because in the military we use maps all the time. And one of my favorite battles is this battle, the Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles, the person in the top left-hand corner, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. There are about 140 to 170,000 Persians. We don't quite know how many. And what he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal path into a narrow pass known as the Hot Gates, which is literally what Thermopylae means. Now, I love this map because you could have choices. You could defend around Athens, you could defend around Thebes, but here was the strategy that they came up with. And there were about 4,000 Greeks in the army, because the actual cities were independent city-states, but they came together in times of conflict. And so there were 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. And this is where we get the story of the 300 from. Now, I was using something in my organization called a SWOT diagram. That's how I used to run my business. Have you heard of SWOTs? So I thought I'd create a SWOT for this battle. So strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up, a truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're actually Athenian, we hate the Spartans. And the threats: the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. So I simply put these next to each other and asked, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? A magic framework or position and movement described by a map. What would you use? A map. And what was I using? A magic framework. So at this point I said, right, I've got to start looking at maps of my competitive landscape. So I went back into my organization and asked everybody, send me all your maps. And they sent me loads. They sent me customer journey maps, mind maps, business process maps, systems maps. So this is a systems map for the online photo service. And I was looking at this and quite excited. I thought I'd move a component. So I moved CRM, customer relationship management systems. There you are. That's exciting. I'll do it again. So tell me, how has the map changed? Oops, how has the map changed? It hasn't. If I take a territorial map, a geographical map, and I move, I don't know, London and put it next to Malmo, has that map changed? So why hasn't this changed? It's not a map. Perfect. The one thing all these maps had in common was none of them were actually maps. They're all graphs. Now, to explain the difference, the three images at the top are all identical graphs. They're three locations in the UK, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by 2 roads, and they're all identical graphs. The three images at the bottom are all completely different maps. Can you see why they're different? A compass, yeah. So the interesting thing about a map and why it's different from a graph is that in a map, space has meaning. So if you move a component, it changes the meaning of the map. Now, in order to give space meaning, you need 3 basic components. You need an anchor, such as magnetic north. You need position of pieces. This is north, south, east, or west of this. And you need something known as consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. There's no teleportation. Okay. So how do I turn a systems graph into a map? Well, first of all, I'm going to have to start with an anchor. But what's the anchor? So I chose the users. So I had the business and the consumer. Depending on the type of map I'm doing, it could be government regulators, there could be many different anchors. Okay, now what? Well, all of them have needs. So in the case of my business back in 2005, consumers wanted online image manipulation, photo storage. The business, we needed to sell subscriptions to the website. Okay, and we needed to sell prints as well. Now, all of these components have needs as well. So we need the website, needs a runtime, an operating system, compute, ultimately power at the bottom. So now what I've got is an anchor at the top and position described through a chain of needs. And the further I go down that chain, the less visible things become to people at the top. So the consumers didn't care about the power I was using, but of course it's important, otherwise they wouldn't get the things they cared about. Now this is still a graph. So how do I turn that into a map? Well, it turns out that all of these components are forms of capital, and they evolve through a common pattern. You start off with the genesis of novel and new items, then you get custom-built examples, or if we're talking about practices, emerging practices, then you get products and rental services, or if we're talking about practices, they start to converge, and finally it becomes commodity accepted. And so this is a map. If I move any component, it changes the meaning of the map. Does that make sense? Yeah? So what? Why does this matter? So I'll give you an example. This is an insurance company in 2010, 11-ish. This is a process flow, a graph. They needed to put compute in their data centers. And they had a bottleneck in terms of modifying and mounting computers in their racks. And so they came up with a plan to get rid of this bottleneck using robotics. And they spent about 6 months working on this, a wonderful business case, return on investment calculations, sub 1 year. They're all about to go. And I was asked, what did I think? Well, the problem we have in organizations is that organizations tend to be led by stories. And the problem with stories is we tell people that great leaders are great storytellers. So when I challenge your story, I'm actually saying, I don't think you're a great leader, which is why people get defensive. So I can't go and challenge why they're doing robotics, because they've got their entire story, they've built their business case. So I said, could we map it? 15 minutes of argument, and then 15 minutes of producing a map. Here it is. User needs compute, order server, goods in. They thought order server, goods in, and servers were very commodity. Compute they thought was more of a product for some reason. Rack mount, modify. I'm going to leave that there and just put a timer on. Shout out if you've got any questions about it. Have a look at the map. Anybody want to ask any questions about the map? Right, perfect. Okay, that took about 10 seconds. So one of the things about a map is I can challenge the map without challenging somebody's story. So I'm saying the map is wrong. And so what I said was, why do you have custom-built racks? And they said, well, because we have custom-built racks. We've always had custom-built racks. Well, what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, they don't fit our racks, so we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. And that's why you need robotics. Yes. And somebody in the room simply went, why don't we use standard racks? And at that point, multi-million-pound project disappeared out of the window. Now, these people weren't daft. What they were was trapped by past narrative. Because at some point, there was no such thing as a standard rack. So they had to use custom built. You also learn a pattern here that everything evolves. Whenever you have a map, all of these components are evolving if there is competition. And so that brings us on to patterns. Now, patterns I learned through what we call pre-mortem challenge and post-mortem learning. So we use a map to challenge what we're doing, and then afterwards, after we've built it, we use the map to see what changed, where we were wrong. And there are 3 basic types of patterns that you learn. The first is climatic patterns. These are economic patterns, the rules of the game. There's about 30 of those. And then you learn principles. These are universally useful patterns. There's about 40. And finally, you learn gameplay, ways of changing the market to your favor. And there's about 150 of those, and they're all context specific. So I've sneaked a couple of principles in there, so I'm going to quickly go through them. Number 1, know your users. Sounds simple. Number 2, focus on user needs. Sounds an obvious thing to do, but remember back in 2005, thinking about users and user needs was like a revelation. Number 3, know the details, know the value chain or the supply chain if you're across industry. We still do a poor job of that today. Then number 4, understand what is being considered. There's a world of difference between a custom-built rack and a commodity rack. So I'll introduce another one. And for this, I'm going to use a heavy engineering example. This is HS2, high-speed rail. James Finley, he was the former CIO. Now, James had a problem. We needed to build HS2 in a virtual world. And the reason for doing so is it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we've got that wrong, than the English countryside. So this is a graph of HS2 in a virtual world, the components needed. Now, the way we used to run government projects back then, this was about 2012, is we used to group it together in things that sounded similar. So lot 1 would be engineering, lot 3 is back office stuff, and then we'd outsource it to suppliers, and then we'd suffer massive cost overruns and failures. And we just kept on repeating that process. So James didn't want to do that, so he drew a map, and he sent me the map and said, how do I manage an environment like this? Now, this was quite easy for me, because all of the components are evolving. They're moving from this uncharted space where they're chaotic, uncertain, unknown. That's what Genesis is about. And eventually becoming more commodity accepted. So you take penicillin. It starts on the left, it ends up on the right. Same with computing. And we'd learned that there was no such thing as a one-size-fits-all methodology. So agile in-house development was very strong on the left-hand side because it's good at reducing the cost of change and change is norm. Whereas on the right-hand side, you get to things like Six Sigma and outsourcing are strong because you're focused on reducing deviation. You don't want to change, you just want the same thing over and over. And in the middle, it's all about learning and reducing waste. So things like lean, MVP, all that stuff becomes good. So we could simply go, right, stuff on the left, build in-house with agile techniques, stuff in the middle, off-the-shelf products, or use lean if you're building, stuff on the right-hand side, outsource to utility providers. So we learnt the lesson of use appropriate methods. And this project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee because it was delivered way ahead of schedule, way under budget. The problem is, every time I do this talk, if I do it at an Agile conference and say Agile doesn't work everywhere, they normally go, burn him heretic. And I get the same if I do it at a Six Sigma conference. They're like, burn him heretic. Especially if I do this talk at a SAFE conference. Have you heard of SAFE? I used to be the chaos monkey for the leadership team in SAFE. They asked me to come along, and I explained it had a context, a place where it works, and of course, I've never been invited back. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about project management, finance, marketing, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. So if I take lot 1 engineering, and just show you the problem that occurs, we'll take lot 1 engineering, and I'm going to overlay that on a map. So this is lot 1, and these are the components we're deciding to outsource. I can tell you that this is going to fail before we've even started, because the stuff on the right-hand side can be specified, and the stuff on the left-hand can't be specified. We are going to cause cost overruns. Now, the problem is you'll get into a fight with a vendor because of these cost overruns, and they can point to all the things that were delivered successfully, and all the bits that weren't are because you didn't know what you wanted. You changed your mind. Well, the reality is you can never know what you want. It's about learning. Of course, unfortunately, somebody on our own team normally goes, next time we need to write a better specification. If you have one of those, just fire them. You can never solve the problem through a better specification. So we use this stuff in UK government. One project alone, we saved about 425 million, about 1.5 billion in its lifetime, simply by mapping the environment out. I mean, the Carbon Mapper satellite, which was done by NASA and Planet Labs, they used maps, or my form of maps, between both groups to communicate what was needed. And I believe this was delivered under budget, ahead of schedule as well. Most organizations have a poor understanding of who their users are, what their user needs are, what the supply chain is, how evolved those components. They tend to try to apply one-size-fits-all methods, and most of their contract structures are flawed. Now, you might say, well, how do they survive? Well, the good news is they're competing against other people who suck just as much as they do. So as long as you're all useless, no one gains an advantage. The danger is when somebody else is different. Okay, so another set of patterns are the climatic patterns rules, and we use those for explaining change. So here's a map, roughly 2005, of compute, user needs, and application, best coding practice on a runtime operating system, best architectural practice on compute as a product. Now, one of the patterns we've learned already is everything evolves if there is supply and demand competition. So we knew that compute was going to turn into a utility. I actually thought it was going to be Google. It turned out it was a friend of mine, Ben Black, who'd proposed EC2 to Jeff Bezos, and it was Chris Pinkham and others who built it in South Africa, and so they came out with EC2 in 2006. So that's the first pattern you learn. The second pattern you learn is past success breeds inertia. Netflix, Blockbuster. Who was first with a website? Shout out. Blockbuster, yay! Who was first with video ordering online? Blockbuster, yay! Who was first with video streaming experiments? Blockbuster, yay! Who went bankrupt first? Blockbuster. So Netflix was a DVD mail order company. Blockbuster was out innovating everybody. Do you know what their problem was? Late fees. They made most of their money from late fees. Do you remember, some of you won't remember this, we used to have these things called video cassettes. God, this is getting old. Or DVDs. Probably don't even know what they... Anyway, so you used to get them from the store, and then you'd forget to bring them back the next day. That's where they made most of their money from, late fees, and that required a physical store. Now, Netflix was a DVD mail order company, so it didn't have that problem. You got sent a DVD, when you were bored with it, you sent it back, they'd send you a new one. So Netflix had no barrier to getting into streaming, but Blockbuster did, and that was the physical stores. The next pattern you learn is as things evolve, we get co-evolution of practice. So when compute went from a compute as a product to compute as a utility, its characteristics changed. One of them was MTTR, mean time to recovery. So we went from high mean time to recovery to low. So it used to take us weeks and months to get a new machine, and then it took seconds to get a new virtual machine. So our practices changed. We went from capacity planning, disaster recovery test, you remember those? Scale up. And our new practices became distributed systems, designed for failure, chaos engines, continuous deployment. We could do continuous deployment in the old world, except for we were waiting for months for the machines to turn up. Okay. The next pattern you learn is efficiency enables innovation. As the underlying components become more standardized commodities, we can build things more quickly. It's easier to build houses with bricks and planks, standard planks and pipes. The next thing you learn is higher order systems create new sources of worth or value, the adjacent unexplored. So what you have is this combination of new value, speed through practices, and efficiency because of the underlying technology change. Which is why you have no choice over evolution. That's known as the Red Queen effect. So as people in your industry adapt to a new world, a more industrialized commodity, everybody's under pressure to do the same. You also learn a pattern known as Jevons paradox. So Jevons paradox, William Stanley Jevons wrote a book about the coal question. And they made steam engines more efficient, so people thought we'd use less coal. What happened was the opposite. We used more coal. And the reason for this is because of these new industries are being created, increase the demand for the underlying resource. So back in 2010, with cloud, the shift to utility, of course, we'd get executives running around saying the usual nonsense of, we can get rid of all our sysadmins. And of course, a few years later, they're hiring them all back again, but now they're no longer called sysadmins, they're called DevOps engineers, DevOps, or SREs. Does anybody remember that? Yeah? Yeah. So, they're talking about we can get rid of software engineers with large language models. Well, they can. You're just going to be called agentic herders or AI wranglers, but you'll get a pay increase, so don't worry. All right, so what? Well, the thing about the map is that once you've got the baseline and you can apply the patterns, you can see where to invest. So back in 2006, we knew cloud was going to be big, there'd be an emerging practice, we didn't know what it was going to be called, there'd be new things. So that's where to invest, and you learn where not to invest. So best architectural practice for computers a product, not exactly your focus. So I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical. Have you heard of Canonical? Yes. Yes, Ubuntu? Yes? Right, so we were 2 to 3% of the operating system market against Red Hat and Microsoft. We used a map. It took 18 months. It cost £500,000. And we're tiny compared to the monsters of Red Hat and Microsoft, but we took 70% of all cloud computing. Does anybody remember those days where Ubuntu was like that, and then suddenly it dominated cloud? Still does today. Anybody remember that? You are mapped. All right, but of course everything evolves. So eventually the emerging practice got a new name. Andy and Patrick called it DevOps. The best architectural practice for computers a product got a new name. We called it Legacy. Then by 2014, the runtime itself started to shift to more of a utility. We gave it a useless name, serverless. Of course, there are still servers underneath it, but it doesn't matter. And the same patterns occur again. We get a new emerging practice. Eventually, we call it FinOps, and you also get new needs. Of course, where you should invest in 2016 is around the serverless with things like Lambda, emerging practices. Eventually, we called it FinOps. And the new needs. Where you don't invest is all that stuff stuck behind inertia barriers. But of course, in 2016, if you went to a conference and said DevOps and cloud is going to become the new legacy, everybody went burn him heretic. Anyway, you can read about this in a book called The Flywheel Effect. It's about an insurance company and its transition to serverless. And that leads me on to stratagems. So how do you play the game? Well, unfortunately, there's 150 different patterns here. We don't have time. There's a wonderful book called Reaching Cloud Velocity. It's AWS's own second ever book created by people inside AWS. You'll find 17 pages of mapping in it, including a particular model called the ILC model, which is a way of chewing up industries around you. So now let's get on to AI. I'm going to take the map, I'm going to ignore most of it, and I'm just going to expand bits out. So what we've got is user needs an application, needs a coding environment, needs FinOps, needs serverless. So what we understood back in 2018 was machine learning, aspects of it were rapidly industrializing. AI is, of course, an entire field. There are many, many different components. So we knew it was going to become more of a utility, and there would be new practices, and there would be new needs. But that wasn't really that exciting, because the blast radius of this change wasn't that big. Except when we combined it with some of the practices from FinOps. And this created this idea of conversational programming environments. Now, it wasn't a new idea. It dates all the way back to Nicholas Negroponte work on architecture by yourself, and the ideas of graphical conversation theory, which was based upon the work of the architect Jonna Freeman. So the design process can be viewed as a conversation occurring between different perspectives, sometimes in different minds, sometimes in the mind of a single designer. And the question becomes, what happens when one of the designers is the machine? So I did a talk on this, and then a friend of mine, Alexander Simovich, went and built it and presented it at AWS reInvent in 2018. So this was an AI system which you could have a conversation with, and it would build you other systems. So Alexander Simovich was the first vibe coder. And it's worth looking into the stuff. Actually, his system, you not only had a conversation in text, you could actually have a verbal conversation with, and it will build you other systems. Obviously, things have improved since then. So we roll forward to 2023. We now understand these things are called large language models, large multimodal models, great. And the practices are, co-pilots, prompt engineering, chops, vibe. I'm sure we'll come up with a different term tomorrow. The point about this is these practices are still emerging. We don't know the right way of doing this yet. The second thing is same economic pattern. You have no choice over evolution. So at some point, you're going to have to adapt. The third point is Jevons paradox plays again. So yes, I know you get people saying we're going to get rid of software engineers, and Klarna, I think, said we'd get rid of our people 2 years ago, and then, of course, secretly now is hiring back as quickly as possible. So yes, I'm afraid Alice, the software engineer, is going, soon to be hired back as Alice, the human AI system integrator. No different. All right, so now I'm going to get into coding. So if I take the map and I ignore most of it, except for co-pilots and coding environments like Visual Studio, those are tools. And our tools are changing, becoming more conversational in nature. And the language is changing. So we're not so much coding in deterministic languages. Increasingly, we're coding in non-deterministic prompts. And the medium is changing. We're moving from simply code as text to include code as images. How many of you have generated an image using a seed, which happens to be another image, or written a piece of code, or had an AI system write a piece of code based upon an architectural diagram you've drawn? Yeah? Okay, so we are changing from purely a medium of text to a medium of images. And that matters. So this is a map on the right-hand side of coherent city transport. I do a lot of work in healthcare and finance and agriculture and transportation systems and space as well. So this is a map of coherent city transport. You don't need to read it. It's just an image. On the left-hand side is the code that generates the map. Now, the point about this is when we talk about the map, we talk about objects, relationships, and context. But the same conversation, when we talk about it in code, in text, we talk about it in terms of rules, syntax, and style. So the style of conversation that we have changes with the medium that we're actually using. And you see this in every engineering department. Every engineering department, or pretty much every engineering department, has a whiteboard. How many of you are engineers? Hands up. How many of you have whiteboards? Right, okay. So we talk about the same problem, but the conversation that we have on the whiteboard is different from the conversation that we have on the screen. One is about context, relationships, objects. One is about syntax, style, and rules, even though it's the same problem. So our tools are changing, our languages are changing, and the medium is changing. So what? Well, to explain why that's an issue, I'm going to have to get into culture and sovereignty. And I've only got 15 minutes left, so we'll have to go quite quickly. So before we get there, just a quick recap. We started off with my origin story, how I got into maps. Then we talked about maps themselves, what they are. Then we talked about using them to discover patterns, use the patterns to understand change. AI is just an evolution of underlying technological components, and we talked about how coding has changed. Things I want you to walk away with are: 1, observe your environment. Really important. 2, realize there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all methodology. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about project management or even financing. 3, you have no choice but to adapt to the changing underlying technological change. And yes, our tools, medium, and language are changing. Now, tomorrow at 1:55, I'm doing a talk on rewilding software engineering, where I'm going to go a little bit deeper into why we need software engineers. I'm going to go into the illusion that is architecture. I know people think those diagrams are important. They usually have no bearing on reality whatsoever. Then we'll get into decision-making and why software engineering is not an engineering subject. It's actually a craft. The only bit of engineering and software engineering is actually testing. So we'll get into that. Then we'll talk about how you deal with legacy. How many of you heard CEOs, executives talk about the magic of AI is it's going to make their legacy disappear? Yeah, well, we'll get into that. And if we have a chance, I'll get into space. So now you've got a choice. I can either tear you through the issues of culture and sovereignty, i.e. we go into the red pill, or you can ask questions. What would you like me to do? Culture? Red pill. Oh gosh, you brave people. All right. So many, many years ago, people used to tell me, you've got to have the right culture, and I used to read these wonderful books on culture, and nothing made sense. And then I went and looked at anthropologists, because they're the experts on culture, and I came across Krober's work. So despite a century of effort, and this was 50 years ago, to define culture adequately, there is no agreement amongst anthropologists regarding its nature. So the experts on culture can't even tell you what culture is, but in the business world, we love to write books on the subject. Fantastic. And then I came across the work of Margaret Mead, fantastic anthropologist, and she explained how language is a discipline of cultural behavior. Now that creates a problem. It's known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So if you try to describe a system within itself, it cannot be complete and true. So if language is part of culture, you won't be able to describe culture effectively with language alone. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. Can I map it? So I started looking at values, and I started taking collectives, different collectives, and looking at how they valued things, whether things were accepted, converging, emerging. So unionization, paid holiday, universal basic income. And what I quickly discovered is those depended upon other components, like anti-discrimination laws, workers' rights, civil rights. Those depended upon things like the abolition of slavery, which depended upon reciprocity and fairness. Now, all of these components are evolving. So we can describe values within a system as components with connections between them, and they follow the same patterns. So what I did was I decided to squeeze it all down into a pipeline. So those pipelines, like tools, mean a common meaning. And so I squashed all the values down, and I ended up with, here is my basic image of culture. We have a collective, it has values. And I thought, well, can we improve on that? So I got 2 warring groups in the UK back in 2016, roughly, who could not agree on anything. And these were Brexiteers and Remainers. And I got them together in a room. They can't agree in story form. So if you ask one, do you want a cup of tea? They say yes. The others would go, no, we'll have coffee. It was just childish. But we could agree through the medium of a map. And so I got them to expand this out, and this is the map they created. So at the top are the concept of we and me. We is all about control, collective, power relationships. Me is about individuality, agency, again, power relationships. And it goes through various components all the way to things like symbols, rituals, and heroes. And I thought, well, no wonder I can't explain a simple line if this is what culture looks like. And it was interesting is there were various patterns in here. So a collective needs success in spreading its values, which values influence your behavior, and we feel a sense of safety if we're surrounded by similar behaviors, which give us a sense of belonging to the collective. And you can use this both for reinforcing and destructive work as well. The behavior itself depends upon things like values and principles. So if we have a principle like focus on user needs and your values, your beliefs are everyone's equal, then your behavior will be focusing on the needs of everyone. If your value, your belief is that people with green eyes are better than everybody else, you'll focus on the pretty awful behavior, the needs of people with green eyes. And then I started to look at values themselves. They were connected down to memory, symbols, rituals, and heroes, or what we collectively call art. And we've used art to change behavior and values in society. One of the largest forms of art today is video games. Anybody know this game? Cyberpunk 2077, yeah. Here's another game. Anybody know this game? It's called Holy Defense. Anybody want to guess who the gaming studio is? Hezbollah. So hang on a minute. Why is Hezbollah producing AAA video games? Any ideas? Because they're using it to expose to the world their particular set of values. In the same way, we've used art and Hollywood and statues and stories to do the same. Anybody ever heard of the story of Robin Hood? Yes. So you know the story. The story is about the Sheriff of Nottingham, this law-abiding, upstanding citizen, and this evil criminal, Robin, and his band of murderous thieves who are stealing from ordinary people. Yes, that's the story you've heard. No. So what's really important is how we tell the story as well. Now, you control other people by controlling the tools, medium, and language. So if I control the printing press, I control the medium, such as paper, and I control the language, the written word, then I control what sort of stories you can create. So if you come along and say, hi, I want to talk about evolution, I can, if I don't like that idea, I can say, oh, you can't have that word. I'm going to write a paper on it, not on our paper. I'm going to publish an article, not with our printing presses. Very powerful. Tools, medium, language, I've seen that somewhere before. So that's the real change that's going on in terms of these models, is that they influence and change the way you reason about the space around you. Now, when you are using a large language model, GPT, to write your code without ever inspecting the code, so we're talking true vibe coding here, not software engineering plus AI, the problem that you have is the AI system will embed whatever values it has been trained with within your system. Now, you might think, oh, they're our values. That depends. So this is correlation between GPT and humans and the cultural distance from the United States. So you can see, if you're a US citizen, the response is very close to your sort of cultural values, whereas if you're from other parts of the world, it may not be. So LLMs are a non-kinetic form of warfare. No different from Hollywood, no different from how we've used art in the past. And that leads us on to sovereignty. So normally when we talk about sovereignty, we talk about it in terms of territorial sovereignty. So here is our landscape and here is our border. And within this border is our society, our values, and our behaviors. Now, if you cross our border, we will tend to conflict with you. There are three basic forms of competition. One is competition. Competare means the act of groups seeking something, and we do it either by fighting others, conflict, or we do it by collaborating with others, So laboring with others, collaboration, or we do it by helping others, cooperation. And we often do all of them at the same time, okay? So we tend to conflict with you if you cross our border, and we may cooperate or collaborate outside, okay? But what does that mean in terms of if I'm looking at the automotive industry? So this is a graph of the automotive industry. There's a whole bunch of components in there. Where's my border? So back at the DVLA, this is in 2015, 10 years ago, we mapped out the automotive industry, and we used those common economic patterns to roll it forward to 2025. And we could see that more and more of the automotive industry was going to become more commodity-like. So users want to get from A to B, they want a bit of status, that needs a car, but more and more of these components are going to become commodity. And that was fascinating because we looked at China and how it does its strategic investment, very focused on this industrialization. So we started to say, well, how are the car manufacturers going to react? So we thought, well, first they're going to introduce some sort of digital subscription model for design features. This was back in 2015. And sure enough, I think in 2018, we started to get online digital subscriptions for warm seats. Is that, I don't know who, is it Mercedes or BMW who did that? BMW, yeah, you could pay to get a warm bottom. Fantastic. Not that we cared much. What we cared about was status linked to route management. So to simply explain, you're increasingly driving along in your car, Gold member comes along in their self-driving cars, what's going to happen? Yes, leave it to the market. The other cars are going to get out of the way because that's Gold member. All right? Now, this is a problem because that's embedding social inequality into transportation systems. And of course, if we have a flood, that means all the poor people can't get out, only the people with Gold member status. And that means next day we get pitchforks and revolution. So we try and avoid that. But there was another problem, the trolley problem. So I want you to think about a self-driving car here. You've got a choice. You can kill one person or 5 people. Those are the only 2 choices. Who do you kill? Well, that's the only 2 choices you've got, and that's all the information. Who do you kill? 1. Do you all agree 1? All right, let's accept you say 1. Okay, challenge. What if the 1 person is a Gold member? Definitely, kill the 1. All right, okay, we can see your values, very good. Okay, what if the system controlling the car is written by an AI? Where do your values come into this? Okay? So what we learned back in 2015 is users are a member of society, and society has values, and those values would be embedded in the simulation models. We didn't call it training data back then, for these intelligent agents. So if we want borders, that's where we needed a border. We needed, for example, all symbolic instructions with these systems to be open, and that includes the training data. Other areas we might collaborate and cooperate with. But our problem is where are our maps, radars, and situation rooms for the political, economic, social, technological, and legal landscapes? We don't have them. We're very good at the territorial, but we're operating blind in these other spaces. Anyway, I started you off with the origin, how I got into maps. We talked about maps, then I talked about using them to discover patterns, which you can use to anticipate change for investment. We talked about the technological change of AI, how coding is changing, and that change of tools, language, and medium, how it impacts culture and is a sovereignty issue. So 1, observe your environment. 2, realize there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. 3, you have no choice but to adapt to this world. 4, the tools, language, and medium are changing. 5, this can change the values in your society. You might be okay, let's become more like the US or whatever values they have embedded, Oh, that's fine, but at least make it a conscious choice. 6, this is why AI is the sovereignty issue. And at that point, I'll say thank you.